Hello everybody. Recently I explained both the USSR and the PRC, and the most common request I got was to explain modern-day Cuba, closely followed by requests to explain North Korea. Tell me in the comments how badly you want that. That being said, we will go over the history of Cuba, the way the government works, and the way the economy is structured. Cuba is one of the few nations left which calls itself communist. So we're going to see some ways they tried to implement socialist praxis in the way they run their state. Oh, also apparently this video already exists. But I decided to still finish this one. For one, because I already spent half a week on it when I noticed, and also because that video is mainly economic, which is fine, no video covers everything. What I'm saying is that my video can add something to the conversation by talking about Cuban history and politics, and not just mentioning the same things in the same order. The written history of Cuba starts when a guy called Christopher Columbus arrives at the island in 1492. Of course, there were 300,000 people already living on the island, as they had been for 4,000 years before that, but we know only very broad things about them, because the Spanish murdered them all. Sometimes deliberately in war, and sometimes accidentally with disease, and sometimes on purpose with disease. Cuba was then considered a Spanish colonial province. In this period, a lot of white people settled on the island, and because this is the Atlantic, during the time of the Atlantic slave trade, a lot of African people were kidnapped and used as slaves on the island. A lot of white people and native people also fell in love and had mixed-race children. All of this combined to form Cuba's modern racial makeup, with about 10% of the population being black, 25% being mulatto, which is a local term for mixed-race people, and around 65% white people. Cuba remained a Spanish colony until America decided to blame Spain for an accidental explosion of one of their ships. After this war between the Spanish and the Americans, appropriately titled the Spanish-American War, Cuba and the Philippines were seized by the USA. At this point, the US took a bay called Guantanamo from Cuba, officially to defend Cuba's independence. Cuba was occupied by the US government until 1902. The government then was a partially democratic rule of the bourgeoisie. Eventually this guy came to power and he suspended the elections, and then this guy, working with this guy, started a revolution and overthrew that government. That was in 1959. And will you look at that? It's the Cold War now. And oh no, the revolutionary were communists, while the USA right next door is capitalist. As we all know, freedom and democracy is when you overthrow a socialist government in Latin America. And Cuba is one of those. So in addition to the CIA trying to assassinate Castro, they also launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a military attempt to overthrow the Cuban government. Naturally, Cuba didn't feel safe as a socialist nation besieged by the capitalist USA. But fear not, there was a communist superpower just a continent away, called the USSR. And the USSR agreed to support Cuba by stationing medium-range ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear weapons in Cuba to deter an American invasion. Of course, for the USSR, this was also a way to get back at the Americans who earlier stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey to threaten the Soviet heartland. But the USA would never stand for someone doing the exact same thing they are doing, so they promptly, illegally embargoed the island and threw live bombs at Soviet submarines who had the audacity to travel in international waters at peacetime. Nuclear war almost broke out when the US was throwing bombs at nuclear-armed submarines which were authorized to fire back with nukes. But the flotilla captain kept a cool head and didn't do the obvious thing of firing back at the Americans who, again, were throwing live bombs at foreign ships in the middle of international waters in peacetime. I still don't get why the international community didn't condemn the USA's actions. Eventually, the USSR agreed to withdraw missiles from Cuba, which the Cubans were not a fan of. They feared another American invasion without Soviet protection, but the Americans promised that in return for removing the missiles, they would respect Cuban independence, and So far they kept their word. They still tried to assassinate Castro for the following 50 years. But hey, no invasion. Oh, and that bay which they got after the Spanish-American War to protect Cuban independence, Guantanamo Bay. They still have troops there, and the Cuban government asked the Americans to leave, but they didn't. And the Cuban government can't exactly shoot at the Americans stationed there. That would be an act of war. So essentially, Cuba is asking the Americans to leave, and America pretends not to hear it so they can have that naval base. Of course, America ignores all human rights laws in Guantanamo, but that's not the topic of this video. Between the revolution and 2008, Fidel Castro was the president of Cuba. That's 49 years. He had multiple titles: chief of state, head of government, prime minister, first secretary, and commander-in-chief. Essentially, his jobs were to lead the government and to enforce the laws, pretty much the executive branch of the government. Nowadays, the Cuban president is limited to 2 5-year terms, which I guess is to make sure that they don't have someone else rule for 50 years straight. After Castro died, Castro took power. Raul Castro, he's the brother. And in 2019, they changed the constitution, and with it some of the powers and tasks of the president. And the current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, was inaugurated in 2018. The Cuban national government is similar to the Chinese one, in that it is unicameral. If you remember, the Soviet Union had 2 parliaments working together to make laws. The purpose was to have one parliament filled with the people who were elected by the people proportionally, and a second one which had representatives from all member nations. This way, political minorities like Estonians were given more legislative power to make sure the national government doesn't only work in the interests of the Russians and ignores everyone else. In America, they have a similar system with the House and the Senate. This is important for ethnically and geographically diverse nations. But because Cuba is very small compared to the USSR and the USA, they don't have a second chamber. The National Parliament, also called the National Assembly of People's Power, is proportionally elected by the people. I will explain the elections in a bit. This parliament then votes on who will be president, vice president, attorney general, and a few more. Most notably, the members of the High Court and the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers is just an assembly of all ministers of Cuba. It's headed by the president, and they enforce the laws which the national parliament made, pretty much like ministers in any other country. The High Court is independent and interprets the law, just like in the US and most other countries. And as is typical for socialist nations, this national parliament, with its around 600 elected members, only meets very occasionally, about twice a year. When they meet, they do all the things they are elected for, as well as some other jobs like amending the constitution and to pass, amend and repeal laws, and to debate and approve national plans for economic development and the state budget. So you can see they have no shortage of jobs for the 2 times a year they meet, especially considering they also elect the president, vice president, ministers and high court. If you watch the 2 other videos in this series, you may already know what Cuba does to replace the national government when it's not in session. Exactly, the National Assembly elects a body that takes over all of its tasks, called the Council of State. It has 31 members and does most of the jobs of the national parliament. The only thing they can't do is change the constitution, and most things they do need to be approved by the national government during the next session. This means the Council of State can make laws and appoint ministers, but these things are then voted on by the National Assembly the next time it is in session. These laws are kind of like executive orders until they're approved or stricken from the books by the Assembly. The Council can also proclaim a national emergency and select members of the High Court, again, only until the next meeting of the National Assembly. The Council is made up of members of the National Assembly. They select some of their own members to the Council in addition to the President and Vice President. There are a total 31 members in the Council of State, and they decide on things via voting with different thresholds based on what they are voting on. Now we know that the National Assembly is all-powerful and that the Council of State takes over its tasks and the Assembly elects the Council. But who elects the Assembly? Well, the Cuban people, of course. There are 3 layers to the Cuban government: the national parliament, the provincial parliament, and the municipal government. They all have slightly different features. For example, the municipal government is only elected for 2 years. But in general, it works like this. There's a seat open for an elected representative, and candidates are nominated by assemblies. For example, a seat for a municipality leader would be filled by an assembly which chooses its favorite candidate. These assemblies are run by mass organization, which means trade union, people's councils, and so on. Once they selected their candidate, there is an election. Of course, there is only one candidate running per seat, so it's usually rather one-sided, though they still need at least 50% of the voters' approval to get their seat. If too many people don't vote, they need to hold another assembly and nominate someone else. This is kind of how all representatives are chosen. For example, there is a National Candidacy Commission which collects information on all candidates for the National Assembly, which decides on one candidate per district. This commission is filled with mass organizations yet again, and with representatives from lower parts of the government. For example, municipality leaders would get a say in who will represent their district. The National Assembly is made up of representatives from every municipality, not provinces, only municipalities. Again, the election isn't really an election since there is only one candidate. Instead, the democracy happens with the assemblies that choose who to nominate. These choices are made democratically by the people, so that's a kind of democracy. As I am sure you will notice if you scroll into the comments, Cuba, unlike China, has access to the internet. Computers are pretty expensive and the internet access isn't universal, but there is the possibility that my comments will be full of Cubans telling me all my mistakes, which do that, correct me, so I may not be wrong in the future. The Cuban economy is mostly state-owned, but despite this, 1 in 4 businesses is private, mostly small businesses with only one person, essentially self-employed, shopkeepers, hairdressers, pubs, whatever you can think of. The 2019 Constitution officially recognizes this private property. I'm sure the hardcore communists among you aren't fans of that one. There are of course regulations for these private businesses, and they have to pay a monthly fee, which I guess is just what taxes are, except it's not a percentage but a fixed number every month. The wages in the state-run businesses are fixed by the government. After the collapse of the USSR, Cuba stepped away from a fully state-owned enterprise, instead encouraging worker cooperatives and self-employment. When converted to US dollars, the per-day pay for workers is really low. But this isn't the whole story, because products are super cheap due to government subsidies. More on that in a bit. Cuba has a better human development index than most comparable nations in the Caribbean and Latin America, so that's nice. According to the Cuban government, around 2.5% of the population are unemployed. Note that this was before the virus, and this video is not prepared to explain the impact of the pandemic on the Cuban economy, mainly because we don't know the full impact until the pandemic is over. Around 90% of Cubans are homeowners. After the Socialist Revolution, the state built many new houses which were rented to people at 10% of their income, which is incredibly little compared to any large city. Like that would be €60 a month for me. These houses were originally rented but eventually just given to the people who live in them, leaving them with no costs beside utilities, since Cuba has a law against housing mortgages and no property taxes. After the revolution, landlords were a thing, but the state essentially gave the tenants their house after they paid a certain amount of rent. The landlords were not happy and they all migrated to Florida, and they're on Twitter complaining that their landowner dynasty was interrupted by evil Castro giving people homes. But for everyone except the landowners, this reform was and is great. Land can be traded between people, and they established some market-ish systems. For example, a builder can now build a house and sell it to a private buyer, which before was only possible outside of the law. If a homeowner leaves a house without using it, then it is granted to the people who are living in it. If nobody lives in it, then the government buys it. Government set prices, of course, and gives it to people who need a home. A family is allowed to own up to 2 homes, one normal and one vacation home. Anything beyond that goes to the state. They don't want a new landowning class to develop, they just exiled one of those to Miami. In Cuba, food is subsidized heavily to make sure everyone can afford it. People are also given rations every month. This is the so-called supplies booklet, and it determines what products people get on a monthly basis. This food is not entirely free, but it's extremely cheap. It's sold at about 10% of its market value. The government makes it possible. And this is why comparing wages is impossible. Yes, they make 500 Cuban pesos a month, but they only pay 40 centavos for a pound of potatoes. That's over 1,000 pounds of potatoes a month. Which is why I use the Human Development Index. It's closer when it comes to comparing standards of living. Of course, it's 100% possible to live off your government rations exclusively, but there are shops in which you can buy more things and different products. They're not as heavily subsidized though. The ration books also include more products than these. These are just the ones they always have. Things like meat are allocated as available. The bottom line is that in Cuba nobody has to go to bed hungry. Unless they're anorexic like me, but that's not really the fault of the government. This is of course below Western standards, in which we can buy and eat whatever we want and all stores are always stocked fully. But we're talking about an impoverished Latin American state here, not a G8 nation. And for Latin American standards, the Cuban food supply is great. It's just not possible for every country to live in such excess as we do in the first world. Cuban healthcare is famously way better than you would assume from a Latin American island with 11 million inhabitants and a per capita GDP lower than Albania's. Cuba has many well-educated doctors. The entire healthcare system is free for anyone in Cuba. It's run and administered by the state in a non-profit way. For reasons which involve geopolitics, Cuba doesn't have the ability to treat all illnesses, so the healthcare system instead focuses on preventative care. All checkups are free and getting checked every 6 months is very much encouraged. Because of this, if someone in Cuba feels a pain in their chest, they would go see a doctor. Unlike in the US, in which you hope it's okay because your insurance won't pay for an x-ray without a doctor's notice. And then a year later it turns out it was cancer. Cuban healthcare is very good, and in some metrics it's superior to the UK and other European nations. Though if you ask the WHO about the efficiency, the US narrowly beats out Cuba. This number may prove that socialism is done for, but please remember that we're comparing a poor island country to a global superpower right now. Also, America itself is 37th, so you know. And again, in Cuba you get treatment when needed. In the US you got to have insurance, hope you're not poor. But I guess if you are rich, the American system seems better. It's all about perspective. Cuba has way better education standards than comparable nations. The entire education system was nationalized in the 60s, and anyone can go to school for anything for free. Which is amazing, because here in Austria I had to pay a fee to register for university. In Cuba you can just go there. Cuba has a 100% literacy rate, compared to the USA, who have a 86? Which, I'm just shocked America's that bad at this. More than 10% of the people can read so little that they're counted as illiterate. And of course, in Cuba people choose their career paths, just like you and me. Some people spread the legit lie that state enterprise means the state assigning you a career. That sounds pretty dystopian, which is why of course that's not how it works. People freely choose their education and jobs. Though of course they are forced to work because of the cost of living, and the jobs they want may not have any openings, just like in any other country. A political science major in America has the same issue with getting their dream career. Not to discredit political science, after all that's what I'm going to study at uni, so I just don't expect it to be useful outside of this YouTube channel anyways. Cuban doctors are known throughout the third world as incredibly important international aid. The Cuban government pays the doctors, so the people who are treated pay for nothing, and the host country is only expected to pay to house them. Since the 60s, Cuban doctors have been helping exploited nations from Latin America to Asia. These doctors have done many incredibly good things and greatly improved the healthcare standards in the places they supported. Since the 60s, a total of 600,000 medical workers were sent around the world to 160 countries. There are only 190 countries in total, so this is a very good average. Now, you may be wondering why the Cuban government is spending money on keeping people in other countries healthy. Barely any other nation would ever do that, so why do they do it? Communism and international solidarity. Supporting fellow exploited nations is a core ideal of the Cuban state. If developed nations operated like this, the world would be a much better place. But instead, the USA is embargoing Cuba. Essentially, nobody in the US can work with or trade with Cuba. A ship that visits Cuba is banned from entering the USA for 6 months. And of course, there are other countries to trade with, right? Wrong. America threatens all these countries, so they won't do business with Cuba. There are nations like Spain and China who trade with them, but most nations on the same continent are too scared of the US, except for Venezuela, because socialism. The original reason for this embargo was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they left it in place because they need to do everything to make this communist nation suffer as much as possible. But amazingly, despite being embargoed for half a century at this point, Cuba is doing pretty well. Of course, the embargo is part of the reason Cuba is struggling. Remember when I said meat isn't the fixed part of the rations? That's because international corporations can't do business with Cuba and the USA, so they only work with the USA. During the Cold War, the USSR and other Eastern Bloc nations were able to trade with Cuba to alleviate some of the problems caused by the embargo, which of course means that when the socialist world fell apart in 1991, Cuba was, to put it bluntly, fucked. All trade partners were suddenly gone, and domestic production wasn't yet on a level to support all people. So there was starvation and low standards of living. Kind of makes sense considering nobody trades with Cuba. How is an island nation supposed to prosper without anyone's support? You may be looking at everything we learned today, and you may have a burning question on your mind. How is Cuba paying for all this? Free education and healthcare, paying for Cuban doctors in humanitarian service around the world, subsidizing almost all food, paying the workers in the state-run businesses. How do they do it? The American government can't even pay to fix their roads. How are these communists doing it? Are they printing money? Of course not. That's not how you do economics. Many of my capitalist viewers are confused how the state can make money without the private sector. Essentially, this is capitalism. A business belongs to a person, and the profit that business makes goes to the owner. That owner then invests part of it back into the economy, but they keep most of it in a big pile and watch their net worth go up like a Candy Crush high score. Of course, a part of the money the businesses made is taxed. So the state gets some money and uses it on the people, roads, schools, and so on. But most money that is generated by the economy ends up in the hands of private individuals, usually individuals who are already obscenely rich, because if you are rich already, it's easier to make more money. And the fact that people who are more rich pay less in taxes doesn't help the state budget. Now, here's how this works in Cuba. A business is owned by the state. A business just like the one under capitalism. And so the profit the business made goes to who? The state. And what does the state do with the money? Pay for all the things we talked about before. Because Cuba is a state enterprise, they have way more money available than capitalist states. All the money that goes to billionaires in capitalism now goes directly to the state, instead of only 10% of it being taxed. It's all used for the common good, which is why a small economy like the one of Cuba can pay for all these things, while the American state can't even afford to renovate highways and bridges, or to lay new pipes in Flint, Michigan. It's because in capitalism, most money is in the bank account of a rich person and not being used for the common good. Okay, everybody watch this. Coronavirus. Israel-Palestine conflict. Fuck. You see, other YouTubers are scared of saying these things because they will be instantly demonetized. But luckily, I don't monetize my videos in the first place. So I can say whatever I want to. within the TOS. This is only possible thanks to my amazing Patreons who donate to keep me motivated despite demonetization. And I especially thank Comrade Asshole, Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Hugo Castellanos, Noah, Alki, Attila Nimitz, Bryn Flaws, Chairman Pineapple, Comrade Chup, Daniel Hyman, Dr. Grimm, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gabi Gita, Herdington Gerdington, Joshua Clark, Klastrup, Masije Rodek, Anne Epema, Neil Banderi, Nicholas Wiggins, Nora Quinn, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Stephen and Trey for their generous donations.